Welcome back to Be the Change podcast with me, Stephanie Howlett, CEO of Diversity NL. Have a listen as we explore real life, vulnerable topics on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Become awakened, create culture of inclusion, be brave, have impact by being an ally. Explore how you can be the change that you always wanted to be. We respectfully acknowledge the territory in which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, and the island of Uktamaguk as the ancestral homelands of the Mi'kmaq and Beothuk. We'd like to recognize the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and Nunatukavut and the Innu of Nitassinan and their ancestors as the original people of Labrador. We open our hearts and minds as we strive for respectful relationships with all First Peoples of this province. We search for collective healing and true reconciliation as we honor this beautiful land together and commit ourselves to being stewards who will respect the cultures, traditions, and ceremonies of all who call it home. Welcome back to Be the Change podcast. I have a very special guest here today. Is Colin Krulicki. If you haven't met Colin, Colin's a fantastic human. We've had an opportunity to have coffee together, to have chats together. Colin is the Vice President of Business Markets for RBC. He's responsible for the overall management of RBC's small and medium-sized business clients across Atlantic Canada. Congratulations. I know this is a newer role for you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie.
And as well, he is a team leader and relations manager across the 4 provinces in every city and most towns that would support, somewhere around 9,500 clients. Fantastic. You've got 29 years experience in financial services. You're also an active volunteer within our local ecosystem here in Newfoundland and Labrador with the Janeway Foundation. And you've been on past boards of choices for youth and other different things. So fantastic. Good for you. And you're currently the chair of RBC's Diversity and Inclusion Council for Atlantic Canada. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Stephanie. Good to be here.
Absolutely. So when I contacted you, my vision was looking at allyship, looking at, what's RBC doing? What's the company doing? But first, let's get to know you a little bit and where your beginnings come from. What does that look like for you as a person?
As a person, well, I'll say I grew up in Halifax, born in New Brunswick. I'm a dad of 2 and I'm a husband, and I've got 2 teenagers now, which is a whole other situation. Some of my employees years ago would say, Colin, what's your biggest stress? And they would expect me to say my work or my role of some kind. And I'm like, it's family and it's children. And how do I guide these little humans around? And what does that look like? So that's what gives me probably the most concern and stress in my life. But I've been a banker for a very long time. And I've had the ability, and I'd say good fortune, to travel to various parts of the country in Atlantic Canada. My career is quite broad. I've been in a whole facet of roles. And so when you put a mobility sticker on your forehead when you're younger, you have a chance to actually take in different parts of Atlantic. So I've now lived and worked in Newfoundland 4 times. And I'm currently still in Newfoundland with my family, but I've worked across Atlantic Canada and Toronto as well. Unbeknownst to me, it actually has helped shape my view because, I didn't just stay in Halifax for my entire career, and it gave me a chance to understand who I am in very different communities and having other individuals, I'll say, influence and imprint on me as well. And so didn't really know it until really the past, I'd say 5 or 10 years, maybe the power that provided to me from a diversity inclusion perspective as I put myself in that learning position.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because I think if we have the opportunity, the blessings to travel or to live different places, that we see how business operates differently, and the diversity of people within organizations sometimes looks different than here in Newfoundland and Labrador.
It truly does.
For sure. So let's talk a little bit about RBC. Let's talk about, I guess, your strategy. Let's talk about ERGs, those sorts of things. Like, let's get into a little bit about the business. Like, what do you see? Because when I see and I use some of the RBC videos, by the way, that are up, and it's all about inclusion and diversity. So let's talk a little bit about what that looks like for you.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll start with some broader strokes at the national level. And I'd say I'm privileged, and I'll probably use that word again throughout the conversation today, to work with RBC, because there's a lot of infrastructure and context built nationally to support the efforts of diversity and inclusion. And I've been around long enough to see it evolve with RBC over the years, and as it relates to just how we kind of found our way 20 and 25 years ago to where we are right now. But there is a real mission at the top of the house to foster diversity and inclusion with our employees and stakeholder with our communities. Our purpose as an organization is to help clients thrive and communities prosper. And I've been saying those words for probably about the past 10 or 12 years, and it actually has a lot of real personal meaning for me. But it's the diversity and inclusion actions that we have in place that actually really align with my values. And so, we want to make sure that we are advancing all aspects of diversity, that we're strengthening, the fundamentals of inclusion. And I see us now even talking about economic inclusion as it relates to reliance and I'll say, alliance with other organizations and suppliers, et cetera, that also share these common views. I've chanced to hear directly sometimes from our most senior leaders, and I love it because it's very clear how important people are to them and how important diversity is to the business. And so fundamentally, it aligns with my values. You mentioned ERGs, and so I would say for those that are listening, what an ERG is, it's an employee resource group. And there would be 8 different employee resource groups that we would have in Atlantic Canada that would align nationally. And employee resource groups, the intention here is to raise awareness, raise understanding, help members develop personally, professionally, provide networking opportunities, personal development opportunities. It aligns as well with recruitment and retention efforts, mentorship, coaching, et cetera. So, and then also how we show up in the community. And so it's kind of a broad foundation, but these would be 8 different areas that we have our employees and our senior leaders each kind of aligned and working toward a common good. If you want, I can list them now for people so they can actually get a sense as to what they are, Stephanie.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so there would be 8. The first one would be Mosaic, and this would be about how we are enabling employees of minority groups through investment and through personal development and community engagement. The next one would be Pride, in regards to how we show up in the 2S LGBTQ environment, and how we represent and what visibility looks like and what allyship looks like. Certainly, we have Royal Eagles, which would be focused on Indigenous employees, Indigenous community, Indigenous rights, and learning. We have Women, as it relates to how do we make sure that we amplify women's role in RBC and inside of our community. We would have Next Gen, which would be for our younger generation. I love that one. I still feel I'm in that group, but I know that I'm not. But it's all about allyship and how do you really support the next generation to learn and to absorb. We also have it's a relatively newer one. It's the Atlantic Black Action Committee. And this was actually formed new, and it's for Atlantic, and it was formed after the murder of George Floyd. And we'll probably talk about that later as well, because that was kind of a changing point for me, to be honest with you. So that particular ERG is around, how we have, alignment and support for Black employees across Atlantic Canada in regards to development and visibility and how we show up in the community. We have Reach, and Reach would be for persons with disabilities and how we look to remove stigma, how we look to drive inclusion and make sure that people understand how we can bring our full selves to work. And then the last one would be eye care. And eye care is a newer one. So it's actually the letter I in care. This was a newer one and developed in the past couple of years. And it's about caregivers. And we either have elder care, child care, partner care, or self-care. And I think after walking through what we have with COVID and everything the past few years, the whole concept of care and mental health certainly is front and foremost. And you probably also see some alignment as it relates to some of these ERGs. So, for example, REACH, and eye care from a mental health perspective, right? And certainly, a lot of employees would have a lot of alignment with a number of different ERGs personally. And we don't mandate anybody to do anything. This is about employees across Atlantic Canada that want to find a place to belong and want to find a place to develop. And it can be as easy as just attending a couple of events that are put on by our employees who run these ERGs. And yeah, I would be the chair of the Leadership Council in Atlantic Canada for D&I. My role is the easy one. I get a chance to work beside some amazing RBCers who bring such passion into their cause. And sometimes the most complex thing is how do we get everyone to talk together? And sometimes there's so much, how do we share, the events and the learnings with RBCers? Because we also are, we also have a job to do in front of our clients. Like if we're going to really help our clients thrive, we need to be meeting clients and in front of clients. And so it's kind of that balance of how do you share, how do you learn, how do you become a team? Especially when we're trying to connect, say Gander, Newfoundland with St. Stephen, New Brunswick, and Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, the Summerside PEI. And so how do we get all these RBCers across 4 provinces to connect, and then we connect nationally? So anyway, that's a bit of a sense of our ERG platform, but it provides a really good foundation for action. And I think that's where inclusion is born. It's an easy word to say, but if you're going to drive inclusion, there's got to be action to make something happen. And so, yeah, I'll leave it there, Stephanie.
So definitely one of my favorite words is action and impact. So it's because what you're describing to me, I guess, is conversations I have with a lot of organizations. But to be honest, very few are as fulsome as RBC, having those employee resource groups laid out. I love the last one, I Care. I think it's a piece that most organizations haven't probably thought about, to be honest. It's a lot of foresight there. And, mental health, caregivers, there's so many different things to kind of unpack with that one. All of them is certainly, it's just good business. And I think we've learned that, and probably RBC probably has learned that before a lot of organizations and corporations. It's good business to look at our employees, to look at our clients then, because, our employees reflect our clients. So who we're hiring is a reflection of our clients, because if I'm walking in and I'm for instance, a Black, queer, disabled person, like I'm looking at the staff to say, like, who am I, do I see my representation here, for instance? Do I see, me being a part of this branch of this organization? Like, how will I be serviced as that person? So really looking inward and outward facing.
Yeah, it's really true. And again, the power of RBC, and I know there's other large scale organizations that are doing incredible work. And I applaud that. And I wanted to continue. I wanted to expand because it's not just RBC. There's so many great allies out there. But, I can only speak for RBC because that's where I work. And that's been my brand for many, many years. But there's been a real decision as it relates to how we are going to drive something. So, for example, there's a real mission, not just for allyship, but to actually drive the increase of representation, for example, of women and BIPOC employees into senior roles, right? So there's been real commitments made at the top of the house. And for that to happen, that comes back to people like me and my team across the country, for example, as it relates to who are we recruiting. Because if we are going to achieve the fundamental objectives of the organization. And we know that when we have a blended organization full of different viewpoints, we will be a stronger organization for our future. It means we have to be deliberate sometimes at how we are advancing people. And everybody, and if you look at these ADRGs, like I'd be a member for them very easily, right? But we have to, be thinking this every day, and not just because it's good business. And I think, the world today, it's the right thing to do, right? It is, if you want to sleep at night, and if you want to know that you are having impact, a lot of times it's the little things every day that are going to have a very big impact. And then, so for me, I do things personally, but professionally, I really care. I do reach out to my employees, and I do give them personal time. And this is employees of my employees, right? I give them personal time on their development and their career streaming, and trying to make sure that people know it is safe to speak up. We do an employee engagement survey every year, and honestly, and if any of my people watch this podcast, I hope they hear that from me, and that one of the questions that mean the most to me is it's safe to speak up. Like, I want a team, I want RBCers to feel like I do, which is you have a voice. And I think that's, again, back to diversity and inclusion. And part of my learnings over the past number of years, especially, I think I've realized how privileged I am to not just have a voice, but to never have been asked or considered the ramifications of having a voice. And I think that's just come with maybe with age and experience, and actually learning of putting myself in that position to understand that, you do have privilege, and not everyone has that same privilege. So how are you going to pay it forward? How are you going to make sure that every single person on your watch knows that they have value, knows that you want them to be their authentic selves, and that their voice is important in every sense of the word, not just for RBC and not just for business, but for them to live their lives, right? And to be the humans that they want to be.
Absolutely. So that's a whole lot to unpack, by the way. So you got into personal relationships, which we know it's good business. Like, besides being good business, it's just being a good human, right? So personal relationships, crafting them, hearing actually about people, all of this makes complete sense. Creating psychological safety, which is pretty much number one in any organization. It is number one factor why people will stick around, why people will applaud the organization and want to stay and go up through the ranks, shall we say, within the organization. I love that you're looking at being intentional. That's what I heard from a lot of this. We're being intentional about things because we know we have to be to support people, right? So, and I'm hearing you say that there's a whole lot of privilege from your perspective, and what that looks like, how you help raise other voices, and I guess RBC is raising them, throughout the organization, and being intentional around, like mentoring people, sponsoring people up through different positions, and asking, are you interested in, what's the next steps for you, and those sorts of things, which is, fantastic.
Absolutely. And you mentioned privilege, and I mentioned George Floyd, and I wanted to speak to that because I've been successful overall throughout my career. And I've known over the years that I have privilege, but it's tough sometimes for me to even admit that to myself. And it was after the murder of George Floyd, it was interesting because at that point I had two much younger teenagers. And I remember having a chat with them one night. I thought to myself, I think they need to know what happened. I think it's important that they hear this from me. And I was telling each of them around, what happened in regards to a Black man being killed by a white police officer. And it was in the moment that I realized, if I were a Black man with a Black child, I would have had this conversation probably 10 years ago. And it really did hit me, because I was thinking, that's the definition. I would have choice. And then I always considered myself to be an ally, and to not be a racist, and to support. But that's when I realized, wow, like there's a real difference here. And somehow I was choosing not to have that conversation to protect them from what? From reality. And so that actually had me rethink what privilege is to me. And I recognized the need for, inside of RBC, that I need to have different conversations with my employees. At that point, I was the regional vice president for RBC here in Newfoundland Labrador. And I remember thinking in the months that followed, I want to do something, but I'm not quite sure what to do. I don't want to have a weekend meeting and then go back to normal. I think this is a pivotal time of change in our lives. And so you're going to be part of the change and make action happen, or you're going to just let it be a weekend. And so it took me a couple months to figure it out, but I ended up having a monthly dialogue with every employee in Newfoundland Labrador. And it started out as talking about reflections of the murder of George Floyd and I invited my regional president from Halifax to join me, and it was through Zoom. And so my employees had a chance to see me talk and my regional president talk about who we are and our feelings and what this means to us. And then we got a number of our folks on the line started to speak up. And then I realized we had a couple more of those chats. And then I realized this is not just about what happened with George Floyd and what it means to be, or to try and understand where, if you're a Black individual, like what life looks like. I fell back on the ERGs to say, this is a platform where we're going to start diversifying our content. And so I'd say once a month, maybe once every 2 months sometimes, we would change the dynamic. So there would be a pride-focused conversation. There would be one for Royal Eagles. There would be one for Reach. And so it allowed us to be talking, having uncomfortable conversations, I'll say. Yeah. It allowed us, and I think it allowed me to learn a lot from people. So there's times I'd have some of my employees actually join. So for example, there would be newcomers. So I remember having a call with one of my newcomer employees who came over to RBC, over to Canada as a student. And she was talking about the student entry as a newcomer. And then I did a lot of work with the Association of New Canadians here in St. John's. And so we had a great individual join us there who arrived as a refugee. And so we actually contrasted the refugee entrance to Canada compared to the student entrance to Canada. And this is where I was learning a lot. And I think that's where intention comes in. You have to put yourself in a position to learn. You have to put yourself in a position to ask questions and to be vulnerable and, to model the behavior. But I know I had a lot of employees really happy with those calls. But honestly, for me, I think it was, they're some of probably the best memories I have over my past almost 30, because I was actually putting myself in a place where I was uncomfortable and learning and speaking and using my voice differently. And that's when I actually realized I'm probably more of an ally today, because you can't be an ally without a voice. And, silent allies don't really work. Not everyone has to have a bullhorn to be an ally. So, but you have to use your voice in some way. And sometimes it's the big things, and sometimes it's the small things, one-on-one with people. But allyship doesn't work if you don't speak.
100%. In all the communities and all the ERGs you have, it's all about allyship and how you create, voices for people to feel safe enough within the organization to talk about things that are happening, their experiences, the good, the bad, the ugly, the indifferent, for them to, for employees to be able to raise their voices, and as well for learnings. I mean, because, we're white and we have white privilege. And what does that look like for us? Like, we both have different privileges, and how are we using them in our personal lives, in our business lives? And, amplifying voices is a great one, to be able to amplify those of people in our organization that normally, don't get that chance to speak at the leadership level. Having those tough, and they are tough, vulnerable, uncomfortable conversations. No one is born being able to have these conversations. It's something that I think through time, and I think you and I had this same conversation over coffee at Starbucks one time, that I think when George Floyd was killed, that's the pinnacle point for me in my business as well, wanting to do better, wanting to learn more, wanting to basically be able to raise voices and being able to become better allies. And of course, we know we're only allies when people say to you, you're an ally, because that's kind of something that's bestowed upon us. And it's, I think it's a lifelong journey of allyship and trying to do better, and I guess trying to do more within our local ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember that was the beginning. So I always pride myself on trying to be a good leader and trying to be a good person, an RBCer. But I also realized after that moment that I hadn't been unpacking a lot with my employees who were different than me. So they would hear that I'm supporting them for sure, but I never really asked them about themselves, right? Mm-hmm. And so I actually reached out to a number of my employees from different backgrounds. And, some were from China and some were from other parts of the world and Black. And I remember having a chat with a Black employee, and he was so open with me. Because I was asked him, I said, so how are you feeling, right? Like, if you want to talk, I'm here. Would love to hear your story. And, he said to me, he talked to his mom the day prior, and she was saying to him, and she doesn't live in this country, she lives just someplace else. And she said to him, be careful what you tell this Colin guy. Because then he'll have information, basically, right? And so he's telling me the story, and I said, so your mom is saying be careful, and he's like, yeah, I tried to say it's Colin. But she is trying to protect him. So part of that protection is telling her Black son, you need to be careful what you're telling to the white leader, because that information, he could take pieces of this and it could actually impact you in different ways. And so just to hear that conversation as it relates to, my parents never sat back and said to me, be careful what you say to your leader, be careful of this. I'm thinking to myself, they never actually said to me in my childhood, like, go ahead and do something, but they never said not to. And that's also when I realized, wow, I don't know these stories. And I also, there was a lot of, concern as relates to some of our employees from China, and back with COVID and everything else. And I remember talking with one individual in particular who also said to me, it's very hard, Colin, sometimes, you want to bring your best self to work, and I'm calling clients up to book appointments, and sometimes the clients hang up in my ear. And this individual had an accent, but I could understand her, no problem whatsoever, right? And so that was impactful, because I realized, even with our training programs, part of that, it's you need to call X number of clients and, book appointments and practice your skill sets. And what would it be like if half of my phone calls that I made hung up on me? How does that break your spirit? You have to pick yourself up. And so that actually changed kind of how I view training programs and how I ask different questions. And so now, if I am in front of someone that has a thicker accent from a different place of the world, now I'll actually have a conversation as it relates to that, if I feel as if that's the place that the employee wants to go. And so I can't say I have that chat with every single employee, but it's on my mind differently. And so, it's very different. And so this is where, again, you have to take and be influenced by those around you and hear people's stories and understand, okay, so how do I shift? How do I change?
Absolutely. And I think that's a part of being an inclusive leader, being able to see different pieces that impact your, there are folks that you're working with. It could be your clients, whomever that is that, you're having relationships with in a personal or business level, being able to shift and if you could walk a mile in their shoes or even walk a step in their shoes, the way that we'd feel, what that would be like. And I think that's the part of allyship, being intentional, being curious. Curious is one thing, and respectful, but us as well doing our homework and, tomorrow, Truth and Reconciliation Day, looking at our Indigenous folks and like, what are we doing to help and what are we doing to support? Because there's a whole lot of travesties that have gone on. And some people use the word celebration, but it's certainly not a day of celebration. It's certainly a day of to remember to look inside us. And I think in our organizations and, how are we supporting, what are we doing? What are some of those moments and some of those thoughts that we're going to have, with our families or with ourselves, during the business day or some holidays and those sorts of things. Like, so what does that look like? Can we talk a little bit about that with RBC, like coming the truth and reconciliation, that piece of it?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a very broad topic for us. We certainly we leverage folks inside of our ERG, but we also have a lot of national learning. We have mandatory courses in place for our employees to be able to understand what truth and reconciliation is. We actually have a broad, multi-layered course. Well, it's not mandated per se, it's available, and it really showcases the history of Indigenous peoples and, how we need to show up and think differently about our communities. And so there is just a lot of, again, well, I'm lucky to be at RBC because there's a lot of national infrastructure on this. We actually have also some national events. And so there was an interview done with Buffy St. Marie. And we had a chance as RBCers nationally to tune in to kind of an RBC Zoom broadcast and, hear her story and hear advice from her. And this would be similar with other ERGs as it relates to bringing on maybe some higher profile individuals in the media, in sports, and entertainment to help shape us, right? But I have to say, she was a gem. She obviously is a Canadian icon, an Indigenous icon. She lives down south right now, but her messages were just so simple. But this is where, again, as an organization, how do you show up? So it's through mandatory courses, it's through optional learning, it's through, ERG investment. But you're right, the Day of Truth and Reconciliation is not for celebration. And I know this is a relatively newer statutory day federally for the country. I really hope that we will go far beyond seeing it as a day off with maybe, a half an hour or an hour of learning. I really think this is a chance for, I'll say, government and employers to kind of set the way of why this day is in place, because people have to put themselves on a course to learn and reflect. And it can be through taking part in activities in the community. It can be by, purposely watching events, through online and media, understanding what really happened in residential schools. And I think that gets me all the time is that I'm not an old person, but I'm not a young one. And nothing was taught to me in school about residential schools. And it's just, I don't know how I didn't see it. I don't know how, it's just crazy to see what's happened while I was in the school system. And even as I was developing throughout my career, wasn't aware. So now it's back to personal obligation and responsibility. What do I do with that? How do I push that forward and change the agenda? And even here in Newfoundland Labrador, I've developed some contacts across the province as it relates to reaching out, understanding more. We have a number of different internships that we have for Indigenous employees. And so how do we amplify those? And so again, it's back to just, you've got to make some choices and decisions on how you're going to spend your time.
Absolutely. and like you, same thing, did not grow up really knowing a lot about our beautiful Indigenous populations in Newfoundland and Labrador. And I think we really missed out. And now it's catch up time for how do we support, how do we become better allies? How do we spend the day tomorrow in reflection and teaching kids, if we have them, what the day is all about, and doing better within our organizations, amplifying voices, looking at where we're spending our times, monies, what that looks like for the people across our organizations, of course.
Absolutely. It's interesting, even with land acknowledgements, and I know you have one at the beginning of our session today. It's very easy to be disingenuous with this. And, it's really important for people to be considering what it really means as they're doing a land acknowledgement versus reading a script that they might get, on the internet, or, and it's about acknowledging the land and the waterways that we travel, and recognizing the past and culture that has been lost, right? And this is where, I hope that even just from that perspective, I think it's important that we're doing this to raise awareness, but I think the owner of it has to put time in to think about what that means. And I'll say, even, and mine have changed over time as well, as I actually stopped to think about, okay, what does this really mean to me? And I think sometimes people want to do the right thing, so they want to get it right, so they want to take maybe what's been done, and sometimes it's not intentional, but I think that we can get it wrong if we're trying to be perfect versus genuine in our approach.
100%. And we talked about this a little bit before we came on, that this work is not perfect. It's constantly learning, unlearning, looking at our biases, perspectives, our point of views, and where we come from on all these different topics. And they're hard, to be honest, to look at, and to look internally ourselves as what unconscious biases might we have, where did they come from, and doing some of this work on ourselves before we ever have the conversation with our kids or employees, the people that we work with, right? It's being intentional. It's a piece of it. And every time I read off a land acknowledgement, because I can't quite remember it, the fulsomeness of it, that it's an emotional piece of me of just like, wow, like what have we done? A lot of us are landowners, but is it truly our land? We have a house, but it's not our land. We might have bought it off someone, but truly this was, the Beothiks, Mi'kmaq, Inuits, it was their land, right? Here in Newfoundland and Labrador, it's truly not ours. We may say we have land ownership over it, but truly it's still not ours.
1000%.
Yeah. So as we leave today, tell us, I guess, some actions or some things that you want leaders to look at if they're looking at how they become better allies within their organizations.
Thanks, Stephanie. It's a good question. I would suggest that leaders, either in company or in community, need to really think about how they want to be. Like, who do they really want to be in the community? What do they really want to be known for? What really matters? Because at the end of the day, I'm hoping folks will be saying, you want to see barriers taken down. You want to see people being accepting of other opinions, not tolerating other opinions, but actually accepting there are different points of view and different histories. There's a lot of words around being your authentic self. And I think that a lot of folks don't understand what that means, because they've always lived their authentic selves. And maybe we don't understand the concept because you have been living an honest, barrier-free life of some kind. And, you need to put yourself in that place to ask questions and understand how others are. And, it's not just about race. It's not just about culture and background. It's not just about showing respect. You can show respect but not agree. I think how do we really show up in community? What actions do you take to lead the way? Because if you are an employer, you have a chance to imprint and to show the way for your 3 or your 30 or your 300 employees. And how vulnerable are you, and what could that do for your employees to see you in that position. Because a lot of times employees think leaders have it all, and it's all easy. And sometimes we might forget some of the struggles that we've had. And I think really thinking about how you want to show up, and but you also have a new chance every day to change, right? And that's back to personal reflection, personal accountability. It's back to, diversity is great, and that's a mix, and inclusion is how that mix works together. But, inclusion is also a verb, it's an action. And you can't be an ally, you can't drive inclusion by saying it, you have to do something, whether it's something very small, one-on-one between you and an employee or someone on your street, or it's louder and your voice is more pronounced, but you have a voice, you need to use it in some way, and then hopefully over time that voice will change and get stronger. And so we're not asking everyone to have the bullhorn, as I said earlier. Sometimes it's one step at a time, but voices will get stronger. And I think especially, I think folks would recognize there's a lot of hate and inequality in this world, and it's taking people's personal situations and making them political. And I think we're at a really interesting and dangerous time right now, because hate has an easy voice, but allyship, again, it can just be a very soft voice, but it's about starting something and starting small sometimes. And so I might have rambled, but just trying to get out all my thoughts, I guess, Stephanie.
Absolutely. So tell us, if someone wants to connect in with you, what's the best way of doing so?
Oh, thanks. Well, it could be by contacting you, but so I am here. I think if you were to probably Google me, you'd probably find me here. I live here in St. John's, Newfoundland, with RBC, and you can reach me at colin.krulicki@rbc.com if you wanted to reach out and have a conversation as it relates to things that we do and I might represent for RBC, that maybe you want to have a chat about, and maybe I can help you in the community or in your business think differently or to start something. So I'd love the opportunity to do something like that.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us on Be the Change. It's been a pleasure. Have a great one. And I look forward to further conversations with you.
Absolutely. I really appreciate this, Stephanie. Take care.
Thanks so much for being with us today. Comment below, subscribe, connect with me at stephanie@diversitynl.com or on LinkedIn. Be the Change.